Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Common Gaps in Scrum Adoptions. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're doing well and staying healthy. I'm Jesse Bronson, Marketing Manager at Construx, and today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jenny Stuart. She is the Vice President of Consulting here at Construx. Jenny oversees Construx's consulting services, where she's helped numerous companies dramatically improve their software development and quality assurance processes. Before we start, I wanted to remind you to feel free to submit your questions throughout the entire presentation. My advice is not to wait until the end, ask them throughout, and we should have some time at the end for a brief Q&A. We'll also be sending you an email once the recording of the webinar is available. Jenny, thank you for being here. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for that, Jesse, and hello to everyone out there. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for taking time to join us. Today we're going to talk about 5 common gaps in Scrum adoptions. These are gaps that we've seen over and over and over again in many organizations that we've worked with over the last decade or so to help them adopt or improve their Scrum adoption. So we all know what Scrum is. Scrum is definitely by far the widest used Agile framework out there today. If you look at the 14th annual State of Scrum, the data says that of the teams reporting, they're using Agile practices, 58 report they're using Scrum. And if you say Scrum in combination with something else, either XP or Kanban, you're up to 74%. And so that is a very large use. And sometimes people will ask me why. Why is Scrum so widely adopted? And my perspective is that it gives you a nice minimal set of guidelines and rules to abide by. It's kind of like giving you a minimal set of roles, events, artifacts, and the rules that bind all of that together to give you a good starting point, a good baseline, something that you can build on top of. It's not overly prescriptive. It's very flexible. You can adapt it to many organizations, implement practices that really make it sing in your organization. But it gives you enough to really give you a good jump start on doing effective Agile in an organization. That said, we see many gaps over and over again. And this is everything from we see Scrum being used in medical device companies to web software to systems development, on new product development, on evolving an existing product. So these gaps aren't unique to any one industry or any one area. We see it really across the board. And I've seen this in so many different places for so long that this really inspired me to want to write a white paper. So if that's of interest, you can reach out to us or check out our website. The white paper is available there. And to have this talk to help you see if any of these gaps are really happening on your team and see if there's some things you can do to address those. So really to raise that awareness and help people to improve their adoption so that Scrum actually is really ensuring that you have a healthy Agile implementation. It's beneficial, it works well for the team, and it works well for the business that the team is operating in. So let's talk about some of those gaps. The first gap is missing or insufficient focus on quality. So Scrum has this wonderful thing called a definition of done. And the definition of done is simply something that every team member needs to agree to. It needs to be understood, but Scrum doesn't tell you specifically what your definition of done should include. And it really does that on purpose because the definition of done for, say, a web-based company that has a lot of redundancy, does a lot of A/B testing, does a lot of incremental rollout, that can look quite a bit different for the definition of done of, say, maybe a regulated medical device company, where it's really important that that medical device company have all the necessary I's dotted and T's crossed on their documentation so that they can effectively go through a filing and a submission and make sure that they're adhering to everything that the FDA would expect from them. So Scrum simply says that you need to have a definition of done, and it's intentionally vague because the details should vary widely from team to team. That said, many teams that we work with don't have a shared definition of done that everybody agrees to. Instead, what we see is quite a few series of anti-patterns. One is just that it's completely missing. It's absent. The teams never really thought about it. They maybe weren't even aware that there was a definition of done. And so raising that you need a definition of done is sort of an aha moment for them. And they go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We really should have a shared understanding of all of the work we need to complete within the sprint boundary. Other people will establish one early on, but then don't use it much. Or establish one that's pretty weak. I was in an organization once a number of years ago, and I saw their definition of done written up on a whiteboard and said code compiles, checked in, hopefully unit tested. Yeah, that's a pretty superficial definition of done. I would expect something that's a lot more comprehensive and complete. Again, if you think of what Scrum wants us to do, we want to bring the software inside of every sprint to a potentially shippable or a potentially releasable state. We may not actually release it because there's not enough value to release it to our users or our customers, but we could release it if we wanted to. And so we need to make sure that we consider all of the aspects and elements necessary to truly produce potentially releasable software. The other thing I sometimes run into is a team will show me a definition of done. It'll be like a page or longer sometimes. It's beautiful. It includes everything you would ever want a team to potentially do. And the teams had nothing to do with creating it. It was imposed on high from somewhere outside of the organization. If you turn that DoD over to the teams and say, are you doing this? They start laughing. You say, can you do this? And they start looking through it and saying, well, we can do these pieces of it, but these pieces of it really aren't something that we can do within the sprint boundary. And so you need to make sure you engage the teams to create a definition of done so that they are part of building that and that they really understand, buy into, and agree to use it from this sprint forward. So how do we use our definition of done? You sit around and you talk about it. What kind of testing are we doing? Unit testing, integrational testing, functional testing, regression testing, selected regression testing to make sure that we're doing that testing in a particular area, batteries of automated tests. What are all the different types and kinds of testing that we need to do, including is there any test case generation or test case review? What is our shared understanding of everything we'll do in the sprint boundary here? What about reviews, code reviews, test cases reviews? Will we review all the code? Do we review selected code, code we decide we will review? Are we going to do test case reviews? Is there anything else, maybe documentation reviews that need to be part of completing the work inside the boundary of the sprint? What about tools? Is there static code analysis, security checks, code style checks? If these are just built into the build system, we probably don't need them in the DoD. But if there's, say, some specific manual security tests that need to be run, we may want to make sure that we have that. And certainly we may want to just have a quick thing that says all of these tests all run successfully and that we've addressed any issues. If it's not part of gating the check-in, then we need to make sure we take a good look at that and ensure that we actually address this. Any documentation that we need to do. So is there design documentation, user documentation, release notes, help notes, internal architecture documentation or API documentation we need to keep up to date? Is there anything related to getting things ready for deploying the software, assuming that we're not doing that within the sprint boundary? Is there any updates to scripts or updates to a deployment document that we need to do? And you might take a look at all of this and kind of say, wow, this is a lot. But remember, we're going to make sure that we decompose the work so that what we do bring into the sprint boundary is small enough that we can do all of this. We don't want to do a whole bunch of things that are all partially done. We want to do a core set that are really done to that potentially shippable state. And that's what the definition of done is meant for. And that is what it really helps us align on and understand. And I always tell people, you look at your definition of done today, You look at what truly potentially shippable software would look like, and that becomes your process improvement list. If you have things related to manual testing that needs to be automated, if you really would like to have some static code analysis and some quality checks, that becomes your list of activities to become a better Scrum team or a better organization of many Scrum teams working together that can produce higher quality software. So a really important thing to think about, use, and make sure is high quality is this definition of done. And why is that? Well, what we really want to do is we want to think the way that Steve McConnell wrote of years ago in Rapid Development, where he said, all good software development processes put defect detection activities as close as possible to defect injection activities. And so we want to find, we're human, we make mistakes, we want to try and find as many of those mistakes as early as we possibly can. We want to make sure that we identify any issues in how the code was constructed. We want to see if there's any issues in the design. We want to use our sprint reviews to see if potentially maybe we built the wrong thing this sprint. We have a requirements defect and we need to fix that. And we want to make sure that we're finding and fixing those throughout the whole project so that we don't end up at the end of the project or the release in infinite defect mode, that setting where you kind of never know when you're actually going to ship, because for every defect you find and fix, you inject one or more new defects into the system. We don't want that. One of the things that Agile wants us to do is build high quality, potentially shippable software throughout the entire project or the entire release. And that's what our DoD is there to help us do. Gap number 2, insufficient staffing of the Scrum roles. So Scrum brings a number of roles to the table. We have the development team, the Scrum Master, the product owner, and all of those roles play a key and important part in making Scrum work. So if you think about Scrum without any of these roles, it's going to struggle. It's going to have a hard time. It's kind of like you're missing the oil in the wheels of the cog of Scrum to make it really work well. And these roles provide checks and balances. So what a product owner wants to do versus what a Scrum Master wants to do, what their focus is really different. So a team who has, say, a Scrum Master but no product owner is really going to struggle in making sure that they're delivering the most important business value to the organization. A team that has a missing development team member, say they really need some test resources or a back-end development resource and they don't have that, they're going to struggle to produce that potentially shippable software every day. So we need to understand these roles and then staff them effectively. And this is a really common and honestly quite painful gap for many organizations. So some anti-patterns that we see here, just a missing product owner. So there's a team, they've stood the team up, they think Scrum is wonderful, but there's absolutely no product owner giving the team guidance. And the role of a product owner is to make sure that the work of that Scrum team is really providing the most value to the organization, ensuring that product backlog is filled with the things that bring the most business value to our stakeholders, to our users. And without a product owner, a lot of teams struggle to actually do that effectively. I jokingly tell a lot of people that the product owner and the product backlog is basically the fuel for the Scrum engine or the wheel that drives the Scrum car. If that's not right, if it's filled with the wrong things, if it doesn't have enough detail in it or information in it, yeah, we might be doing 120 miles an hour, but we might be running in the wrong direction. I'm here in Seattle, Washington. We might be driving to Chicago when we really meant to go to San Francisco. So it's really important that we have a product owner to provide that information. One thing I sometimes see is, well, their quote is a product owner, quote, there's somebody who's been given that title of a product owner, but they don't actually participate with the team. And in many ways, it's the same thing as a missing product owner. There just really isn't one. Somebody in the organization has the title, but they're not in sprint reviews. They're not in refining meetings. They're not in sprint planning meetings. They're not working in the product backlog to make sure it's filled with the right stuff. I see this a lot in organizations where maybe there's a business representative or a product manager who we'd really like to have as a product owner. In fact, they might be the perfect person to be a Scrum product owner, but they don't have the bandwidth or time, or maybe in some cases, interest to do it today. And so we give them the title, but they don't fulfill the role. And so we really need to take a step back there and say, okay, we need to have an actively engaged product owner who's the best fit for this team today. The other thing that I sometimes see is a person who's a proxy product owner. And this can work, but I would say we need to approach this with caution, because most of the time I've seen proxy product owners not being able to have the detail or be able to provide the team with the day-to-day guidance and information necessary for Scrum to be successful. And so they end up playing basically a telephone game to the person who really should be the product owner. And so, can work, but be careful with it, because often it won't, and it's just as painful as an inactive or missing product owner when it doesn't work well. There's also some issues with Scrum Masters and how Scrum Masters get staffed. One of the ones I see a lot is what I would call the, oh, by the way, Scrum Master. This is sort of when a team starts doing Scrum and everybody looks around and says, who should be the Scrum Master? And suddenly everybody took a step back except me. And I'm standing there and it's like, oh, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. But this person isn't necessarily very interested in being a Scrum Master. I want somebody in the Scrum Master role who's passionate about Scrum, who's passionate about Agile, who wants the team to become an ever-learning, ever-growing, ever-improving team. And somebody who doesn't have a lot of interest in the job is really going to facilitate the events, but not much more. Sometimes there are people who have kind of been an oh, by the way, Scrum Master who are really interested in doing it, and that's great. We just need to make sure we give them the time, the support, the education to help them be successful in it. In some cases, it's just not the right person for the job. We need to find somebody who's interested, enthusiastic, and motivated to be a Scrum Master. The other thing I'll sometimes see is a command and control Scrum Master. So this is a Scrum Master who feels the job is to tell the team what to do. So I'm going to get up in the morning and I'm going to tell you what to work on today and when it needs to be done, and I'm going to check in with you. And that's not what a Scrum Master does. I coach a lot of teams with Scrum, and I'm always telling them that the role of a Scrum Master is hand the pen to the team. Right? If they need to do an estimate, I give them the pen, let them estimate. If they're thinking about what they need to work on today, let's go to the board and let's take a look at what needs to be done next. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I might help you know where to go to look to see what to do, but it's not my job to do a command and control activity. And in fact, this really undermines that collaborative and ownership feel that I want in a Scrum team. And the Scrum Master's job is to help the team really become collaborative and take ownership of planning the sprint, tracking the sprint, managing their work through the sprint. That's really the job of the development team, the people who are doing the work. So we really do need to make sure to staff these roles correctly. And I spend a lot of time having conversations with leadership, managers, to really look at the gap they have today and figure out the best way. We do have a really interesting white paper on staffing Scrum roles, so reach out to us if you're interested in that. That has a description of the attributes that we're looking for in product owners and Scrum Masters, and some of the pros and cons of different people stepping into these roles. Every once in a while, people will say, well, I guess we'll have to hire new people in order to make Scrum work. And that's not what happens in the vast majorities of organizations I'm in. Really, instead, I think of the Scrum roles as hats. And who can best wear these hats, and what kind of attributes are we looking in the people that wear these hats? And instead we're looking at the best fit for this particular team, for this particular project or this release, and making sure that we fully staff the roles with the people who are the best fit today. And perhaps next year or 2 years from now, it might be slightly different, but for today, these are the best people to do the best job in the roles that we have. You may also find there are times that you want to provide some training or some coaching or some support to help these people be successful. Because again, for Scrum to be successful, you really need to have a Scrum Master and a product owner and a dev team that all work together well to provide that value outcome that we're looking for from each and every sprint. Gap number 3, insufficient backlog refining. This is basically a secret sauce that's overlooked a lot in the teams that I end up training and coaching for. Backlog refinement in Scrum is the thing that makes sure that you're always ready for sprint planning, that the items at the top of the backlog are small, well understood, very clear, ready to work. The Scrum Guide simply says that the refining activity should consume up to 10% of a team's time. So in sprint 22, the team spends up to 10% of that sprint refining for sprint 23 and into, say, the middle of sprint 24. So refinement is a look-ahead activity. It's an activity done with the product owner and Scrum team together. It's a lot about decomposition and clarification to make sure that everything's really ready to go. One of the reasons I think people forget about it is, unlike sprint reviews and planning, there isn't a designated specific scheduled event in Scrum for refinement. There's simply the guidance that refinement should occur. My recommendation with the teams I work with is that we schedule 1-hour meetings twice a week forever into infinity. I like more smaller refinement meetings because I find it gives teams the opportunity to have more at-bats if they have questions they need to answer or information they need to get, or the product owner needs to do some work between this refinement meeting and the next refinement meeting. So some symptoms that you'll see here. Sprint planning takes a long time. I was once in a team and they said, sprint planning takes us 2 days. And I said, how long is your sprint? And they said 2 weeks. And I'm like, 2 days in a 2-week sprint? That sounds really painful. How's that working for you? And the whole team looked at me and said, we hate it. If you look at the Scrum Guide and kind of proportionally in a 2-week sprint, you should be looking at something like up to 4 hours for sprint planning. Certainly not a day, certainly not 2 days. And generally, if sprint planning is taking a really long time, it's because the team is needing to understand a lot of what are we going to build, and that hasn't already been discussed and clarified and understood in refinement, where sprint planning really should be more about we understand the what and we're talking about how we're going to build it inside of sprint planning. You'll often see work consistently slipping into the next sprint. So teams will often bring in stories that are too big to be brought to their definition of done. And one of the keys in backlog refining is to spend the time decomposing those large product backlog items into smaller ones that the team is very confident that they can bring to conclusion within the sprint boundary. And so if you're seeing this, well, it slips over, or every time we have a story bigger than X story points, every time it's a 13 or every time it's an 8, then you probably need to do a little bit more refining, either in general or just making sure that you're refining stories that are bigger than that point that becomes a stumbling block to you. So we don't bring 13s in anymore. We make sure they're always 8 or less. We don't bring 8s in anymore. They're always 5 or less. So a real symptom to look for, and definitely a sign of work items being too big. I see that over and over and over again across the teams that I work with. A lot of questions coming up mid-sprint. If a team isn't able to successfully complete the work because they're suddenly starting to ask, well, what about? Should it do this? Should it do that? Wait, I'm not sure. What exactly are we needing to build? That's a clear indication that you're not spending enough time refining to really make sure that you're building very clear product backlog items. Most teams, what we'll do is build user stories with very clear acceptance criteria, where the acceptance criteria going into the sprint provide enough detail that if I look at the test staff or the people who are responsible for testing on that Scrum team, they're going to look at me and nod their heads and say, yes, I absolutely know how we're going to test this. They feel that comfortable that we have that level of detail. So when you're entering the sprint boundary, those items coming in are very, very crystal clear. If you end up with a lot of downstream rework where you release something and either in the sprint review or after the sprint, you find out it really wasn't what was meant to be built, it really missed the user's mark, that's a sign that we need to make sure that the input into refinement needs to be improved. Certainly, if this happens every once in a while, that's wonderful. If this is happening all of the time, then this is a lot of rework, which is pretty painful for the team and the organization. So definitely looking at your refinement, making sure you have regular refining meetings. Maybe that's 2 hours once a week or 1 hour twice a week, but certainly not 3 hours right before sprint planning or 3 hours the day before sprint planning, because that doesn't give you enough room to maneuver to really get the level of detail and information you need for the sprints to be smooth. And that's what we're going for. We want to make sure the product backlog has enough information in enough clarity that the sprints just seem like you can really be heads down and really focused and really deliver useful, valuable content for the stakeholders and users of your team. So again, something I see over and over and over again, we encounter teams that could vastly improve their performance through better conversations, better backlog refinement, perhaps the introduction of very clear acceptance criteria that tell you what it means for something to be built right. Did we build the right thing? Do we understand the behaviors of how this should perform? Gap number 4, missing or ineffective retrospectives. This one actually makes me really sad because retrospectives, I think, are one of the most powerful things in Scrum. And done well, they can actually be a lot of fun. You can have an opportunity to really learn and find ways to become a much better performing team, to improve the process, to improve the tools, to improve how the team works overall, to learn things that you can do to be better. So one of the real powers in Scrum that gets overlooked a lot. I find a lot of teams end up doing what I call a go around the table retrospective. So they just sit down and they look at each other, and the Scrum Master maybe turns to the first person and says what worked and what didn't work, and then we just go around the room. And a lot of times teams will talk about what worked and what didn't work. And then the next retrospective, they'll talk about what worked and what didn't work. And the third retrospective, they'll do the same thing. And by the fourth retrospective, somebody might look around and say, wow, these retrospectives are a complete waste of time. And they're right, because you didn't talk about what you were going to change. You didn't take action. It's probably the same conversation in retrospective 7 that you had in retrospective 2. The whole goal of a retrospective is to identify a change. Maybe 2, but what I really want is a change that you're going to implement that you believe will make you a better team, that you can then look at the end of the next sprint and say, did we get the benefits that we expected? So those kind of retrospectives where you just talk about what worked and what didn't work without taking actions really are a waste of the time and take away from being able to really use the retrospectives for that process improvement, continuous learning power item that they really are. Another thing that I'll often see people doing is they'll talk about sort of the edge of items. They won't talk about the elephant in the room per se, or they'll talk about superficial items, but they won't really talk about the core problem behind it. So we need to make sure that we're delving into the issues we're seeing. Sometimes it's super clear. Hey, we have so many issues where we don't understand what we're building mid-sprint. I just went to this webinar with Jenny. She talked about this thing called refining sessions. Why don't we implement 1 hour twice a week refinement sessions? Hopefully that'll make sure that we don't have so many open questions in the next sprint, and we'll be a lot more successful delivering what we committed to in sprint planning. And we try it. So sometimes it's pretty straightforward, But sometimes you actually really need to go into things like root cause analysis, doing something like 5 whys. Why is this really happening? To get out of the superficial and into the underlying problem that's really causing the symptoms or the pain that we're seeing. One change they made in the Scrum Guide recently, which I really like, is the idea of taking an action from your sprint retrospective and putting it into your product and sprint backlog for the next sprint. That's actually something I've been recommending to teams for years now as a way of really saying, we're not only going to take an action, we're going to make sure we do something about that action by putting it into our sprint backlog to ensure that there are tasks or activities that we're going to do to complete that action in our next sprint. So making sure that you identify a specific change. My rule of thumb that I typically tell people is that when you look at a sprint retrospective, you should spend about 2/3 of the time looking into the problem and 1/3 of the time determining the solution that you're going to take for addressing that particular problem. And I don't want 15 things, because if you choose 15 things, the likelihood is in the next sprint, you'll do none of those 15 things. It's just too big of a list. So instead choose 1, maybe 2, but a very small set of things that you're going to specifically do. Another thing I see a lot of teams do is their process improvement from their retrospective is so vague as to be unhelpful. It's unimplementable. We should be able to meet our sprint commitments more often. What are you going to change to do that? I don't hear a specific change you're going to make. So I call these improvement ideas. And then I will turn to the team and say, wow, that sounds like a great area for us to improve. Everybody take the next 2 minutes and write down at least 2 things, specific things that we could do differently in the next sprint that would enable us to better meet our sprint commitment. And go that next step to identify something that is very concrete. And think of it as testable. If we implement this, we should see this change. Did that really happen for us? So don't go identifying super vague improvements. Basically, what you're setting yourself up for is you'll probably have the same issue come up in the next retrospective because you really didn't implement anything concrete and specific. I also find that people often hold the same retro over and over again. They use one technique, the most common one being the go around the table technique. And I'm personally not a huge fan of that technique. If you use it every once in a while, I think that's fine, but I personally find that technique really, really boring. And there are tons of retrospective techniques out there. You can do something like mad, sad, glad, where you look at the things that made you unhappy, you look at the things that made you happy, you look at the things that made you angry over the course of this sprint or maybe a couple sprints. If you're looking for something aspirational, you can do the sailboat, where you establish a goal and you say, what is the wind in our sails and what is the anchor dragging us backwards? If you're a brand new Agile team kind of looking to establish a shared vision of your future, you can do a visioning retrospective where you really write a vision statement for the team. If you're looking to take the next step in your Agile journey, you can do Lissa Adkins' Agile Tree and talk about what is the fruit that you want to be able to gather from your Agile journey and what do you need to do to make sure that fruit grows effectively. I've had teams who do process improvement, idea generation, and then we put it on a tree to find the low-hanging fruit. What can we do that's high value but pretty easy so we can get some quick wins? Or to do something that's really a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. I tell people when they get to the point where it's kind of starting to be hard to find process improvements in your retrospective, that's the time to rub your hands in glee and smile, because now you can set up to a grand goal, a big, hairy, audacious goal that the team agrees to and understands. Maybe this is something like you want to improve your velocity by 20%. How can we go about doing that? Or maybe this is something about reducing the number of defects that escape from the team into the user community, and what are we going to do about that? So establishing a bigger picture goal, and then every retrospective is talking about what we can do next to try and move us towards that goal. And so a BHAG could take a team 6 months to get to, or longer, and every retrospective is a way to chip away towards that larger process improvement goal. The other thing I see people do is not looking at your own historical data. So gathering things like, what's your 3 sprint average? Or what's the velocity look like over the last year? What are the peaks? What are the highs? What are the lows? What's kind of best case, worst case? What do our hour estimates look like in terms of what we initially thought versus what they ended up being? How's our commitment level for sprints? What percentage of what we commit to in sprint planning do we actually deliver? All of these can be very illuminating. And in fact, you can have an entire retrospective where you talk about what metrics do we want to gather about our own performance to help us be more data-driven in our process improvement efforts. That can be a really fun retrospective in and of itself. And then last, teams who spend the time, identify a retro improvement, but then never actually make it. That's actually a real shame, because if you spent all this time sitting in a retrospective meeting coming up with a really great improvement, you should implement it. Otherwise, again, we go back to retrospective as a waste of time. And I don't want your retrospectives to be a waste of time. I want your retrospectives to be fun, enjoyable, and something you truly learn from and use to improve as a team. And that's when they become super powerful. So again, Scrum has this inspect and adapt mantra. The sprint review is our product adaptation, inspect and adapt. We inspect what we built. And our retrospective is our process, teamwork, and tool inspect and adapt. And both of those are really important because they make sure that we are moving our way towards building the right thing and towards being able to build that thing in a fun, effective way where we're a good, solid team, doing a lot of what I call serious play. We work hard, but we have a lot of fun working hard to deliver that value. So our last gap is a lack of focus on incremental value delivery. And what I see here a lot is that people aren't laser focused on identifying ways to produce incrementally potentially shippable software at the end of every single sprint. We may say things like, well, let's go off and build most of the database layer before we build any of the ETL, before we build the UI for our reports. That's the opposite of the direction that we want to go. The Agile community will talk a lot about vertical slicing, finding the smallest thing going through all the layers of our system that demonstrates meaningful value to our stakeholders in our sprint review. And that's really the way I want teams to think about this. You need to go into sprint planning, you need to look in your refinement meetings to think about how can we deliver something we can get feedback on. I don't want to just say I was busy. I want to have something that I can really make sure that we get feedback from. If I'm a team building APIs, my feedback is going to be very different from a team who's building something like web releases. But in every case, I want to think about what can we incrementally deliver to provide value. I was working with a team once and they were doing a whole new infrastructure packaging. They were basically completely changing the way that the software packages were going to be deployed. And they were 6 months into a 1-year effort in doing all of this, and they had nothing they could show to people because they'd been building it based on architectural components. So in working with the product owner, we went through an exercise of identifying who were the different stakeholders, and these were stakeholders inside of the development team. So the first stakeholders were other Scrum teams. The second stakeholders was an independent QA group. The third stakeholder were the people who did deployment activities. And then we went through an exercise of, instead of thinking about things from a component perspective, thinking about the smallest amount of every component needed for the first stakeholder to be able to really use and provide feedback on this new deployment and packaging system that they were building. And we radically changed what their product backlog looked like. Now, the product owner, who was actually a technical lead, was still really concerned about making sure he had a view of the overall architecture. And so we made sure those were labeled so he could look at the architectural perspective. So we didn't really change the content of the backlog as much as we changed the order in a way to allow him within the next 3 sprints to produce something that would be able to be usable by the other development teams to give him feedback. And so I'm always thinking about this particular thing. And this is an area where Scrum puts a lot of responsibility on a product owner. And some product owners do this really naturally. Some product owners, this is a little bit of a learning curve, because they need to go through that activity of saying, who are my particular stakeholders? What do those stakeholders need and want? How do I make sure that I order my product backlog to give them the highest return on that? And then convey that to the team so we can continuously and quickly deliver customer value. So this is really a way of thinking about what's the smallest thing that I can build in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever your sprint duration is, that I can get feedback on and demonstrates progress towards our stakeholders, progress for me, and shows the organization where we're heading so that we can course correct as appropriate. So some things that often get in the way, missing key stakeholders. So I had a product owner once who had actually come from the US part of a broad multinational organization. They'd stepped in, they were a subject matter expert, they'd been a user in the field, they stepped in as a product owner. They really understood the US marketplace. However, the product they were building was actually supposed to provide support and capability internationally. And so they did a wonderful job of conveying the needs of the US market, but when the first release of the product went out, the entire rest of the world, so APAC and Europe and others, basically gave the product a thumbs down because they hadn't addressed and understood that there were other stakeholders beyond just the US, and that the domain was complex enough that what people in other parts of the world needed was different enough that that needed to be part of our product backlog. Failing to understand what our stakeholders value, not necessarily spending the time to go off and deeply understand and in fact quantify that. There's a wonderful technique called target ranges and also landing zones, where we can really go in and understand the different aspects of what people value and look for what's the range of success of those outcomes. So if I'm looking for something like performance, there's not usually a single point of success or failure. Rather, there's a point below which there's failure and another point above which we would all declare success and have a party, and it would be like awesome. And then there's the range in the middle that we're really trying to aim for. So really understanding what people need and value and spending that time to take a step back. I was working with a product owner once. He had a big laundry list of a whole set of changes they wanted to make in the system, was kind of struggling trying to figure out which to put highest in the product backlog. And we really took a step back and started asking questions about, well, what do people want and value out of this system? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the business trying to do? We came up with the idea that really what the business was trying to do was increase the usage of this particular tool that they'd already spent a lot of money on. And so they thought that all these different aspects and elements of new functionality or defect fixes might all contribute to that. And we spent some time quantifying that and then reprioritizing the product backlog based on which things we thought would provide that biggest gain in that particular direction. And then he was able to go off, and every sprint, he'd go test with people to see whether or not, A, they were actually seeing increased uptake or not. And they had a couple areas where they did 2 sprints worth of work, saw no change in the increase of uptake, and basically truncated that effort, moved on to other areas that did move the needle and move the needle a lot. So, spending the time to really think about these can be non-trivial, but can be immensely powerful. Not staying current, so stakeholders' values and needs can change over time. What somebody valued 6 months ago might change today as either the marketplace changes, the usage profile changes, our stakeholders in our landscape change. So recognize that this is living and breathing. It doesn't end. It's always there. We always want to make sure we're staying current with this. It might even change release to release as we're focusing in different particular areas. Maybe release 1, we have a particular stakeholder of a persona that we're going for. And in release number 2, instead, we're really trying to make the operations team happy because they've been struggling with some issues that are really costing the organization a lot of money. So we may find, too, that the priorities change a lot, even from release to release. Not exposing early assumptions in decision making. I see this a lot where people think they know the answer, but actually haven't validated it with people. So making sure we get the right people in to validate it, to prioritize it, to make sure that we have alignment. Sometimes there are many stakeholders and we literally have to be prioritizing across the needs of a diverse group of stakeholders. We may need to get a whole set of people into a room and agree on the big picture goal that we're trying to do across all of these stakeholders so that it's easier to prioritize across 10, 15, 20 or more people who all have a stake in what we're building. And a huge one here is not breaking large pieces of work down into ways that we can deliver value incrementally. So seeking and always thinking for how we can deliver something in the sprint that provides value to somebody and not building a lot of componentry where we need 2, 3, 4, 5 sprints before there's anything that is particular user value. So laser focused as a product owner and as a team on discussing together the ways that we can provide vertical slices of functionality throughout every sprint. I'm always amazed when I see gaps here and I take it to the Scrum team and we talk about why this is important, risk reduction, early feedback, things like that. Once they understand the why, Scrum teams are so smart at being able to find different ways of decomposing the work into vertical slices that allow us and support us to get early incremental value delivery and early incremental feedback. So I encourage product owners and Scrum teams to have the conversation and think through ways that you can do this. So we really want to make sure that the excellent delivery engine that is Scrum is fed by a product backlog that is ordered through the highest value and is done in a way where we can incrementally deliver value each and every sprint and get that feedback to validate what we're building and where we're going. And this is really the product owner and the product backlog. This is the steering mechanism for the engine of Scrum, and it is so important to make sure that it is healthy, it is right, it provides us good input to doing the things that we're doing inside of the sprint boundary. And again, gaps in having product owners are going to mean there are gaps in this particular area too. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed our 5 common gaps, ones we've seen over and over again, and hopefully if you are experiencing one, there's at least an idea or 2 in here you can take away and address. If you have some questions, now is a great time to start posting those. We also have a number of resources that are available on our website. So free resources that you can come and get to at construx.com resources or resources-topics, white papers, webinars, other materials. And check out, if you haven't already, check out our Inspect and Adapt podcast for more information on software development. We're constantly releasing new podcasts and new materials all the time.
All right, Jenny. Well, thank you for that presentation. We've gotten several questions throughout, and I'm going to go ahead and ask you one of the first ones. Chris has asked, command and control is the kind of Scrum Master my team expects. How do you overcome that?
So that becomes a discussion with the team. I love the quote, I think it's from Lissa Atkins, where she said, take it to the team. So it may be that they're uncomfortable. And so understanding, and this may be something where instead of sitting down with all of the team members in a group meeting, going and talking to the individual team members one at a time and talking about what Scrum wants in terms of the team members taking ownership, talk about why you think that would be valuable and useful to the organization and to them, and understanding what they see as challenges or concerns. So I actually think that most people are enthusiastic and excited about this once they understand why and what the benefit is to everybody involved. So this is some socialization, and this is some investigation to see there may be something here where there's something inside the larger organization that's causing people to be concerned. And so I'm going to want to go learn about that, figure that out. And this may be where I also, as a Scrum Master, need to be an organizational influencer and go talk to, say, leaders or managers who can help me make this shift. Because if that's happening in one team, it may well be happening across the broader organization and may well be a larger shift that's needed.
Great, Jenny. And we have kind of a related question, I think. The question is, can a team be successful without having a Scrum Master? That is, the Scrum Master role is rotated through the team members and supported by an Agile coach.
It can work. I will say rotation is not my favorite approach, but this is what I jokingly refer to sometimes as beer and philosophy. If you talk to me and you talk to somebody else in the Agile industry, we may not have the same perspective. My concern with rotation is that not everybody likes being a Scrum Master. And so when you rotate it through, you'll probably touch some people who actually find this fun and interesting and some people who don't. And so that's the biggest challenge, is just making sure that the Scrum Master role isn't just facilitating the meetings. If that was all it was, rotation, fine, no big deal. But you're losing the other aspects of that learning activity. So I expect a Scrum Master to be taking the pulse of people's temperatures, going out for coffee with them, talking about where we could go next from an Agile perspective. Hey, we're getting pretty good at this Scrum thing. How about we take a look at test-driven development? Or how about we start talking about, what we can do to help support the organization as it's moving to DevOps. So it's not just about that Scrum event facilitation. It's much more than that. And I find if you're rotating often, not always, you'll only get people who are just facilitating the events, and the power of Scrum is left on the table. But again, I think everywhere what you take a look at is what is the goal? And the goal is to be a learning, ever improving team. The goal is to make sure that you're using the Scrum framework effectively in a way that really works. And if you're doing rotation and everything is going well for you, great, fabulous. That's working well for you. If you're using rotation and you're struggling, well, then maybe it's not the right thing for you.
Thanks, Jenny. Here's a question about retrospectives. Someone has asked, in the present scenario of working from home, how can you get the team involved during the retrospective? I've tried methods like Starfish, Mad, Sad, Glad, Stop, Start, Continue, but don't find the teams very much involved in retrospectives. Any tips to make retrospectives more interesting while on remote calls?
So it's very helpful here to use some of the tooling that's out there. If you have access to like a storyboarding tool like Mural, M-U-R-A-L, or a whiteboarding tool like Miro, Miro, or there are some literally tools for retrospectives where everybody can enter items in simultaneously inside of just a tool that allows people to type information. So I think we can't have just a call. We need to have more tooling support in this new virtual world. Also, you might take a step back and have a retrospective where you retro the retrospectives, right? Say to the team, hey, we are in this enormous shift and gee, it looks like we're going to be here for a while longer. I've noticed our retrospectives seem like they're not as interesting, useful, or fun as they used to be when we were doing these co-located. And spend a whole retrospective talking together about what you could do to make the retrospectives more powerful given the constraints that you have.
Thanks, Jenny. I think we have enough time for maybe 2 more questions. So they're both kind of in regards to the definition of done. So the first one, should the definition of done be common across the Scrum teams in an organization, or should each Scrum team have its own?
One nuance there. So there's nuance number 1, whether or not all these teams work together to build a shared product. We'll have one answer. So if I've got 25 Scrum teams who are all working together to build a product, we are only as strong as the weakest link. So in those particular cases, I will bring together representatives from all of the Scrum teams, and we will create a gold standard or minimum standard definition of done, something every team will sign up to doing. And then each team will build their own DoD where they take that gold standard and they create their own. They can add more to it. They can't take anything away because we've established the minimum bar, but they can add more to it. So the minimum might say something like selected code reviews occur, and a team might say, well, we code review everything, so ours is going to be code review complete. So they've built on top of that minimum. If you're in an organization where you're not building a shared product together, right, there's a whole bunch of individual teams, but they're working on individual products, then I'm not going to try and create a gold standard. But I may have an organizational mandate where the starting mandate is thou shall have a DoD. And then slowly over time, as we start to see commonality, we can add things to it that say your DoD should address. Or you might have kind of a meta DoD. Here are the things your DoD should address. Make sure they address what kind of testing you're doing, what kind of code reviews or reviews you're doing. And so that's really the guidance, is you must have one, and it must consider these aspects.
Great. And I think this will be the last question for the day. This question is, do you see many teams use a definition of ready, and what state does a story need to be in for it to be worked or built?
So for those who aren't familiar, a definition of ready is what you would use to say you can bring something into the sprint. I would say at least 50% of the teams I work with have a definition of ready, and they build it because it's helpful to them to have that alignment between themselves, and sometimes that alignment between themselves and, say, outside stakeholders about what it takes for a definition for you to bring something into the sprint. And people are usually including in that things like no blocking external dependencies, all necessary user interface guidance is available to the team. So if you're doing things like wireframes, the team has the wireframes it needs to enter that sprint. And some teams will have a size restriction, especially teams I've worked with who have stories that have been too big in the past. They may establish a definition of ready, one of those being stories are X points or less. And Jesse, was there another aspect there that I didn't address in my answer?
I think that you got it all, as far as I'm concerned.
Maybe say it for me
as
one
the
more
non-technical
time.
expert. So I've published it. It says, do you see many teams use a definition of ready, and what state does a story need to be in for it to be worked or built?
Okay, that's the state of the story. So normally people will have something like, user story is small, clear, well understood by the team, or something like user story is small and has clear, complete, and agreed upon acceptance criteria. So those are the kind of things that I'll usually see in a definition of ready.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that last question, Jenny. And thanks for the excellent presentation and Q&A. And everyone, thank you for sticking around until the end. And just a heads up, we'll be hosting another webinar on September 1st with another Construx senior fellow, Eric Simmons, about using landing zones to define success. If you have further questions specific to your Scrum adoption, feel free to reach out to me or Jenny, or to any of us here at Construx, and we're happy to see how we can help your team achieve their goals in addressing those. I hope to see you next time, and thanks again.